Seoul's skyline blurred behind sheets of rain as the black convoy tore through Gangnam's back roads, tires hissing against wet asphalt, like the city itself was hissing back. Inside the lead car, Tae-moo said nothing. He hadn't said much of anything in 14 months. Not since the night gunfire replaced lullabies in his son's nursery and left a 5-year-old boy who no longer spoke, no longer walked, no longer looked anyone in the eye. By the time Tae-moo reached the estate gates, his men were already waiting with the same report they always brought him. The newest caregiver had lasted 6 days. 6 days, and the boy still hadn't said a single word to her. Tae-moo didn't ask questions anymore. He simply walked down to the sub-level control room, where 17 monitors flickered to life at his command, and did what he always did when trust ran out. He watched. He told himself it was protection, vigilance, a father doing what a father must after the world proved it couldn't be trusted with his family. He had no idea that within a week, the woman about to walk through his front door would undo, on camera, everything 14 months of grief had built. Chioma arrived, carrying nothing but a small canvas bag and a calm that unsettled the household staff. She didn't flinch at the guards, didn't ask about the wheelchair parked by the crib, didn't try to fill the boy's silence with forced cheer the way the others had. She simply sat on the floor, at his eye level, and waited. Tae-moo watched from the shadows below, arms crossed, expression unreadable, already counting down the days until she gave up like everyone else. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere between the cameras he'd hidden to catch a lie, he was about to catch something he never expected to see again: the truth. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see just how far our story travels together. Tae-moo fired the 6th caregiver on a Tuesday, the same way he'd fired the previous 5, with a single envelope of severance pay slid across his desk and no explanation offered, because none was owed. She had lasted 11 days, longer than most, but not long enough to matter. His son had spent those 11 days staring at the wall above his crib, silent, while a stranger tried too hard and understood too little. That night, Tae-moo called in a contractor who didn't ask questions. A man who'd once wired security for a casino. Tae-moo owned 3 shell companies deep. By morning, the nursery held 4 new lenses, each smaller than a fingernail, tucked into the seams of bookshelves and the frame of a mounted picture, feeding into a bank of monitors 2 floors below the house, in a room with no windows and 1 door that locked from the inside. Tae-moo told himself it was for the boy's protection. It wasn't entirely a lie. 14 months earlier, men working for a syndicate he'd wronged had come through the estate's east gate in the dead of night, and by the time Tae-moo's people put them down, his wife was gone, and his son was a small crumpled shape under a nursery table, legs no longer working the way they used to, voice gone, somewhere even doctors couldn't find. The Baeko syndicate had buried her in silence and rebuilt its walls twice as high. Tae-moo had rebuilt himself twice as cold. He ran an empire that moved through Seoul's shipping ports and back channels like smoke. Untouchable, feared, obeyed. But none of that mattered in the hallway outside his son's room, where he stood some nights just listening for a sound that never came. He had power over cargo routes and rival bosses and men twice his size. He had no power over a 5-year-old's silence. It was his secretary, Lim, who brought him the file 3 days later, a slim folder with a photograph clipped to the corner, a woman with warm brown skin and a steady, unbothered gaze that seemed to look straight through the paper. Chioma Adayeze, Lim said, setting it down like she already knew it would be different this time. Pediatric trauma care, 5 years, 2 of them overseas in conflict zone clinics. She doesn't come cheap, and she doesn't come easy. She interviewed us as much as we interviewed her. A pause. She asked why there were so many caregivers before her. I told her the truth. She didn't blink. Tae-moo studied the photo a long moment, the same way he studied a man, before deciding whether to trust him with a shipment worth millions. "Hire her," he said finally. "And Lim, say nothing about the cameras." She arrived on a gray Thursday morning with a single canvas bag and a calm that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire foyer. The guards straightened without meaning to. The house staff, so used to nervous new hires wringing their hands at the door, exchanged glances at how unhurried she was, how she paused to look at the family portrait in the hall, the one with his wife in it, before anyone told her to. Tae-moo didn't greet her personally. He watched instead from the top of the stairs, arms folded, already counting the days until she gave up like all the others. By evening, he was in the control room, the way he was every night now. 4 small screens glowing blue-white in the dark. CCTV 4. Nursery sat center frame, timestamp ticking quietly in the corner. He watched Chioma enter the room, take in the crib, the wheelchair parked by the window, the small boy curled at the far end of the rug with his back to the door. She didn't rush him. She didn't crouch down and coo the way the others had, didn't reach for toys or plaster on a smile, built for cameras she didn't know were there. She simply lowered herself to the floor, a careful distance away, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Minutes passed. Tae-moo leaned closer to the monitor, waiting for the moment she'd break, the way they always eventually broke, raising her voice, forcing eye contact, filling silence because silence made adults uncomfortable in a way it never seemed to make children. She didn't. She just sat, patient as still water, present without demanding anything back. Around her, beyond the nursery walls, the estate held its usual quiet violence. Armed men, walking perimeter rounds, motion sensors blinking along the fence line, a small war's worth of security, dedicated to keeping tragedy from repeating itself. And in the middle of all that fortified fear, sat a woman radiating something Tae-moo hadn't felt inside these walls in 14 months. Peace. He watched until well past midnight, telling himself he was assessing a threat. The nights that followed fell into a rhythm. Chioma came each morning, left each evening, and in between she did nothing dramatic. No breakthroughs, no forced conversations, just quiet, steady presence that Tae-moo found himself, against his better judgment, waiting to see again the next day. Then came the 28th of October, a date Tae-moo would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. The timestamp read 23:47:15 GMT, when the boy's cry cut through the baby monitor Tae-moo kept, out of habit, on the corner of his desk. Not the practiced monitor an ordinary father would use, but a live audio feed pulled straight from the hidden system. He was on his feet before he'd finished registering the sound, and by the time he reached the control room, Chioma was already moving across the screen, faster than he'd ever seen her move, but not frantic. Controlled, sure, like someone who had done this 100 times in rooms far more broken than this one. The boy had thrashed himself half out of the crib rail, caught in whatever memory his small body still carried of gunfire and screaming, and his mother's hand slipping out of his. Chioma didn't turn on the overhead light. She knelt at the crib's edge in her beige scrubs, her voice pitched low enough that the microphone barely caught it, and gathered his shaking hand into hers. Tae-moo watched, unmoving, as she reached into her bag without breaking her gaze from the boy, and produced a small, soft cloth. She wiped one tear, then another from his cheek, her thumb impossibly gentle against his small, trembling jaw, murmuring something Tae-moo couldn't make out, but somehow understood anyway. The universal cadence of "you are safe, you are safe, you are safe." The boy's crying slowed. His small fingers curled into her palm and stayed there. And on the other side of the screen, in a room built for surveillance, not sentiment, Kang Tae-moo, feared throughout Seoul's underworld, tattooed knuckles that had ended men's lives without a second thought, clapped his hand over his mouth and wept. Not the composed, controlled grief he allowed himself at his wife's grave once a year. This was raw, ugly, silent, his shoulders shaking, his bloodshot eyes fixed on a 4-inch screen, showing him something he hadn't let himself hope for in over a year. His son, comforted. His son, safe. His son, reached. He sat in the dark, long after the nursery had gone quiet again, the recording looping once, twice, a third time, before he finally saved the file and labeled the folder with a shaking hand, Miracles. It became a habit he didn't examine too closely, pulling up the archived footage some nights, not out of suspicion anymore, but because watching Chioma with his son had become the only thing that made the day's violence feel survivable. He watched her sing, low and rich, songs he didn't recognize, foreign lullabies that carried the weight of some other home, some other childhood, and then, seamlessly, old Korean nursery rhymes his own mother used to hum, learned, he realized, specifically for his son. She wove the two together, like she was building the boy a bridge between the world he'd lost and the one he still had. 3 weeks in, the monitor caught something that made Tae-moo sit forward so fast, his chair nearly tipped. During physical therapy, with the wheelchair parked just behind him and the crib rail steadying his small hands, the boy pushed himself up onto trembling legs, Chioma's palms hovering close but not touching, her voice steady and encouraging, and stood, swaying, uncertain but standing, for nearly 4 full seconds before his legs gave and she caught him, laughing softly, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, like he'd just done something worth celebrating, because he had. And then, that same week, a sound came through the speakers that stopped Tae-moo's heart in his chest entirely. Again, the boy whispered. One word, small, cracked, barely audible, the first word he'd spoken in over a year. Tae-moo didn't move for a long time after that. He simply sat in the dark, staring at the frozen frame of his son's face, and felt something in his own chest that had been locked since the funeral, finally, quietly, begin to give. He summoned her to his study 3 nights later, telling himself it was an assessment, a formality, the kind of check any employer owed himself before trusting someone fully with his family. She arrived composed, unhurried, as she always was, taking the seat across from his desk, without waiting to be told, which irritated him, and, somewhere beneath the irritation, impressed him. "You've made progress with my son," he said, voice flat, testing. "He's made progress," she corrected, calm. "I just stopped getting in his way." Tae-moo studied her the way he studied men, before deciding whether they could be broken. Every caregiver before you tried harder than you do. They pushed. They performed. You do neither. And somehow, you're the only one he's spoken to. Because he doesn't need performance, Chioma said. He's had enough people in his life leave suddenly, or love loudly and then disappear. What he needs is someone who shows up the same way, every day, whether or not anyone's clapping for it. Her eyes didn't waver from his. Children don't heal because you fix them. They heal because someone stays. Something in the phrasing landed too close to a truth Tae-moo had spent 14 months avoiding. "You don't know what this family has survived," he said, quieter now, something dangerous and unguarded slipping into his voice. "I know grief when I sit across from it," she said, not unkindly. "I've sat with children pulled out of war zones, Mr. Kang. I recognize a house that's afraid, even when it's dressed up as a fortress." She held his gaze, steady, unafraid of the tattoos, the reputation, the weight of everything he was supposed to be. "You can control every camera, every guard, every gate on this property. You can't control whether your son trusts you. That part only comes from showing up, the same way, every day, same as him." Tae-moo said nothing for a long moment. He had built his entire life on the principle that fear, was the only currency that reliably worked. On men, on rivals, on himself. He'd expected to find the crack in her composure tonight, the seam he could press to remind her who held the power in this house. Instead, he found a woman who looked at him the way she looked at his son, patient, unflinching, entirely unimpressed by the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. For the first time since the funeral, Tae-moo felt something other than command settle into his chest when he looked at another person. It took him the rest of the night to recognize it as respect. Subscribe to see how far this story goes, and comment where you're watching from. I genuinely love to say hello and hear how our story's landing with you. Han Jin-suk had spent 3 weeks learning the rhythm of a house he intended to break. It hadn't been difficult. A woman who left the estate at the same hour every evening, who stopped at the same corner market twice a week, who walked the same 6 blocks to catch the same bus, before someone from the Kang household intercepted her with a car she always politely declined. These were the kinds of patterns that men in Jin-suk's line of work were trained to notice and exploit. He didn't know her name at first, only that Tae-moo, a man who hadn't shown a flicker of vulnerability in 14 months of quiet, brutal war between their 2 syndicates, had suddenly slowed down. Fewer retaliatory strikes, fewer late-night movements through the port district, a man distracted. It took Jin-suk's people 2 weeks to understand why. The caregiver, the one who came and went from the Kang estate like clockwork, who'd somehow succeeded where 6 others had failed, who had, according to the one guard Jin-suk had managed to buy off inside Tae-moo's own ranks, become the reason the youngest Kang smiled again. Jin-suk smiled too when he heard that, not out of warmth, out of recognition. Every man had a weakness, and he'd just found Tae-moo's. The breach announced itself the way breaches always did in Tae-moo's world, quietly, almost politely, in the form of a discrepancy no one but him would have caught. A supply manifest that didn't match the shipment. A security rotation schedule pulled from the system 2 days before it should have been generated. A black sedan, unfamiliar, that had idled half a block from the estate's east corner for 11 minutes on a Tuesday and then vanished before the patrol could reach it. Tae-moo sat with the surveillance logs spread across his desk long after midnight, the way he used to sit with ledgers in his father's study as a boy, learning that the numbers always told the truth, even when men didn't. And the numbers told him now, with cold clarity, that someone inside his own walls had been feeding information out. He called his lieutenants in one by one over the following 2 days, watching their faces the way he watched monitors, patient, unblinking, waiting for the one flicker that didn't match the rest. Most of them held steady. Loyalty, real loyalty, had a particular stillness to it that Tae-moo had learned to recognize over 20 years in this life. Only one man's stillness looked rehearsed. Choi Baek-ho had been with the syndicate longer than Tae-moo had led it, a soldier who'd served his father before him, promoted to second in command not for ambition, but for reliability, the kind of quiet, competent presence Tae-moo had never once thought to question. That was, Tae-moo understood now, exactly why it had worked. Not greed, not a bribe he couldn't refuse. Fear, the specific, corrosive fear of watching the man he'd sworn loyalty to grow soft, distracted, human, in a world where softness got families killed. Baek-ho hadn't sold information to destroy Tae-moo. He'd done it, in his own twisted logic, to save him, to force a crisis sharp enough to shock his boss back into the cold, careful ruthlessness that had kept the Baek-ho syndicate alive for 2 generations. Tae-moo said nothing of his suspicion yet. He simply doubled the guard rotation, rerouted every internal system through a channel only he controlled, and gave a single order that every man on the estate understood, without needing it explained twice. Nothing happens to the woman in the nursery, and nothing happens to the boy she cares for. Not while I draw breath. That night, For the first time since the cameras had gone up, Tae-moo didn't watch the nursery feed to study Chioma. He watched it to guard her. The message came 4 days later, delivered the way Jin-suk always delivered his threats, through a third party, wrapped in the language of business, stripped of anything that could be traced directly back to him. Surrender the shipping lanes through Incheon and the southern ports, hand over the routes that had made the Baeko syndicate untouchable for a decade, or the household currently sheltering Kang Tae-moo's son and his caregiver would no longer be considered off-limits. Tae-moo read the message twice in his study, his face giving away nothing to the courier who delivered it. And then, once alone, he set it down on the desk with a hand that was, for the first time in years, not entirely steady. He thought of his wife's face the last time he'd seen it whole. He thought of his son's small body under the nursery table. He thought of Chioma kneeling on that rug night after night, patient as still water, asking nothing of him and giving his son back a voice. He was not going to lose either of them to this. The plan he built over the following 2 days was not born of rage. Rage made men sloppy, and sloppy men got the people they loved killed. It was built the way he built everything that mattered. Cold, exact, layered with contingencies. He fed false information back through the one channel he now knew Baeko was watching, information suggesting Tae-moo intended to move his family to a safe house outside the city on a specific night, along a specific route. He let Jin-suk believe the trap was working. And while Jin-suk's men prepared to intercept a convoy that would never come, Tae-moo led 11 of his most trusted soldiers, hand-picked, unconnected to Baeko's chain of command, through the service entrance of Jin-suk's compound at the port, 3 hours before dawn. It was, by the standards of the world Tae-moo had grown up in, a small war. It was over in 11 minutes. He moved through Jin-suk's warehouse with the same clinical precision he brought to every negotiation, every shipment, every problem that required a solution rather than a display, disarming, subduing, dismantling Jin-suk's inner circle, piece by piece, without the wholesale bloodshed either side had come to expect from years of retaliatory strikes. His men understood, without being told twice, that this was not to be a massacre, it was to be an ending. He found Jin-suk in the back office, already reaching for a weapon he wasn't fast enough to use. Tae-moo had the gun leveled at his rival's chest before Jin-suk's hand had even closed around the grip of his own, and for a long, silent moment, the two men who had spent over a year trying to destroy each other simply looked at one another across the dim room. "Finish it then," Jin-suk said, breathing hard, something almost like relief in his voice, the exhaustion of a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment for longer than he'd admit. "You've won. Do what your father would have done." Tae-moo's finger stayed steady on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself. He thought of a small boy standing on shaking legs for 4 seconds in a warm nursery, saying again like it was the bravest word in the world. He thought of what kind of father he wanted his son to grow up believing him to be. "My father is the reason half this city is still bleeding," Tae-moo said quietly. "I'm not interested in continuing his war." He lowered the weapon, slow and deliberate, watching Jin-suk's confusion bloom into something like disbelief. "You'll disband your operation in the port district. Every route, every contact, every man under your command, gone from my territory by the end of the month. In exchange, you keep your life, and this ends here, tonight, for good." "You're letting me live," Jin-suk said, like the words didn't fit together right in his mouth. "I'm ending the cycle," Tae-moo corrected. "Killing you doesn't bring my wife back. It doesn't give my son his legs back, or his voice back, or a single night without cameras in his nursery. It just teaches him that this is the only way men like us know how to solve anything." He stepped back toward the door, gun lowered fully now. "I have a family to protect, Jin-suk. Protecting them stops being about how many men I bury the moment I actually think about what kind of father I want to be when I get home to them. He left the warehouse before sunrise, his men securing what remained of Jin-suk's operation behind him, the port district quieter than it had been in over a year. He did not feel triumphant. He felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like he might actually deserve to walk back through his own front door. He found her in the nursery just past 6 in the morning, still in yesterday's clothes, exhaustion pulling at every line of his face. Blood, not his own, dried along one cuff he hadn't had time to change before he'd driven straight home. Chioma was sitting on the floor beside the crib where his son had finally, mercifully, fallen back asleep after a restless night, and she looked up at Tae-moo standing in the doorway with an expression that held no fear, only a quiet, searching concern. "You're hurt," she said softly, rising, closing the distance between them without hesitation. "Not mine," he said, and something in the flatness of his own voice surprised him. The old Tae-moo would have said it as a fact, cold and closed. This one said it like an apology. She studied him a long moment, and then, instead of asking the questions he'd braced for, "What happened? Who did you hurt? Should I be afraid of you?" she simply said, "He's finally asleep. It took an hour to settle him tonight." Tae-moo let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 14 months. He crossed the room and sank into the small armchair beside the crib, the one that had sat unused since his wife died, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the boy's slow, even breathing and the quiet hum of the monitors 2 floors below, still running, still watching, out of habit more than necessity now. "I need to tell you something," Chioma said eventually, sitting on the arm of the chair across from him, her voice careful in a way he hadn't heard from her before. "I've known about the cameras since my 2nd week here." Tae-moo went very still. "There's a lens reflection in the corner bookshelf that catches the hallway light a certain way in the evenings," she continued, unbothered by the tension gathering in his shoulders. "I noticed it my 4th day. I wasn't looking for it. I just noticed, the way you notice things, when you've spent years in places where noticing kept you alive." "You said nothing," he said, low, "because it didn't change anything I was doing," she said simply. "I wasn't performing for your son, Mr. Kang. I was showing up for him. Whether a camera was recording that or not was never the point." She met his eyes, steady as always. "I understood, watching you circle this house like a man guarding a wound, that you weren't spying on me because you distrusted me specifically. You were spying because you'd lost the ability to trust that love could exist in your house without someone paying for it in blood. I decided I wasn't going to punish a grieving father for that. I was going to prove him wrong instead." Tae-moo sat with that for a long moment, feeling something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion or the violence of the night before. "You could have told me you knew, confronted me. Would it have changed anything?" she asked, not unkindly. "Or would it just have made you build higher walls?" He had no answer for that, because he knew, with the particular clarity of a man who'd spent his whole life reading other people's tells, that she was right. "I watched you with him," Tae-moo said finally, quieter than he meant to. "Every night. I told myself it was vigilance. It became something else." He looked at her, unguarded in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be with anyone since the funeral. "You gave him back his voice. You gave me back something I thought I buried with my wife." He exhaled, and the words that came next surprised even him with how simply they arrived. "I don't want to run an empire built on fear anymore, Chioma. I want to build something clean, something my son can inherit, without it costing him his soul, the way it nearly cost him his life. I want to build that with you beside me, if you'll have me." Chioma didn't answer right away. She looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at his son every single day, patient, searching, unafraid, And then she reached over and took his tattooed, blood-marked hand in both of hers, the same gentle certainty she'd shown his son on 100 quiet nights. "I told you once," she said softly, "that children heal because someone stays. Fathers do too, Tae-moo. So do the rest of us." A small smile broke through the exhaustion on her face. "Ask me again, when the sun's actually up and you've slept. But the answer's already yes." His son's 5th birthday fell 3 weeks later, on a bright, clear afternoon, and Tae-moo insisted, against every instinct that told him to keep his family behind guarded walls, that they celebrate outside, in the estate's garden, under real sunlight instead of camera light. The staff strung soft lanterns between the trees. The guards, for once, stood at the tree line rather than pressing close, giving the family a stretch of open grass that felt, for the first time in longer than Tae-moo could remember, like it belonged to something other than war. His son sat in his wheelchair near the center of the gathering, a small paper crown slightly crooked on his head, watching the garden with the same bright, careful eyes he'd had before the world had taken pieces of him away. Chioma knelt beside him, adjusting the crown, laughing at something he whispered to her, and Tae-moo watched from a few feet away, with a lightness in his chest that used to feel foreign, and now, slowly, felt like home. It happened without warning, the way real miracles tend to. The boy's hands found the armrests of his wheelchair, and before either adult could move to help him, he pushed himself upright, wobbled, caught his balance, and took one step, then another, small, uncertain, his face fierce with concentration, moving not toward the safety of his chair, but toward the 2 people standing frozen in disbelief a few feet away. "Papa," he said, his second word in over a year, and his first ever directed, unmistakably, at Tae-moo. Tae-moo dropped to his knees in the grass without a second thought, catching his son as his legs finally gave, gathering him against his chest, while the boy's small arms wrapped tight around his neck. Around them, the garden had gone silent. Guards, staff, everyone frozen at the sight of the boy standing, walking, calling his father by name, for the first time since the night that had broken all 3 of their lives apart. Tae-moo looked up at Chioma over his son's shoulder and found her already crying, her hand pressed to her mouth the exact same way his had been, months ago, in a dark control room watching this same boy on a screen instead of in his arms. He rose slowly, his son settled against his hip, and crossed the grass to where she stood. He didn't plan the words. They simply arrived, steady and certain, the way very few things in his life ever had. "You gave my son back to me," he said, loud enough now for the whole garden to hear, loud enough that every guard and staff member present understood exactly what was happening. "You gave me back to myself. I don't want a life built on cameras and fear anymore. I want a life built with you in it, in the open, where the whole world can see it." He reached into his jacket with his free hand and produced a small box he'd carried, nervous as a much younger man, for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. "Chioma Adayeze, will you marry me?" The garden held its breath. His son, still held against his chest, reached one small hand toward Chioma, as if adding his own quiet vote to the question. Chioma laughed through her tears, nodding before she'd even fully caught her breath, and said yes, in a voice that carried clear across the garden, met by the sudden, overwhelming sound of every guard and staff member who'd watched this family survive the unsurvivable, finally allowed to cheer. Years passed the way healing years tend to, not in a single dramatic turn, but in 1,000 small ones, stacked patiently on top of each other. The Baeko Syndicate, piece by piece, port by port, transformed under Tae-moo's hand into something his father never would have recognized and his son never had to be ashamed of. An international logistics company first, and later, at Chioma's quiet insistence, a foundation that funded pediatric trauma care in conflict zones around the world, the same kind of care that had once walked through their own front door and refused to give up on a silent little boy. The old control room in the estate's basement sat unused for most of that time, the monitors dark, the cameras long since disconnected. On the evening of his son's 8th birthday, Tae-moo walked down there for the first time in years, Chioma beside him, their son, tall now for his age, quick on his feet, endlessly talkative, in a way that still occasionally made Tae-moo's chest ache with gratitude, trailing behind them with the easy curiosity of a boy who'd never once had to be afraid inside his own home. They stood together in the nursery that evening, the same room where everything had changed, now filled with new furniture, new light, no hidden lenses tucked into any corner. Tae-moo reached up and switched off the last dormant monitor mounted discreetly above the door. A relic he'd kept, he realized now, not out of paranoia, but as a reminder of exactly how far they'd come. "You don't need it anymore," Chioma said softly, watching the screen go dark for good. "I never needed it," Tae-moo said, pulling both of them close, his son's laughter already spilling into the hallway ahead of them, chasing some game only he understood. "I needed someone to show me that the only thing worth watching for was already right in front of me." Outside, the estate settled into its quiet evening rhythm. No guards pacing anxious perimeters, no hidden lenses recording secrets, just a family, finally whole, standing in a room that had once been built to catch every lie, and now held nothing but the truth, that the darkest hearts don't heal by hiding behind higher walls and watchful screens, but by finally, bravely, choosing to be seen. Subscribe if you loved how their story came full circle, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and hear which chapter moved you most.